Part 3. Victorious campaign in Aquitania, 56 BC. 20. About the same time Publius Crassus reached Aquitania. This area, as already said, must be reckoned to be a third of Gaul, because of its extent and population. Knowing that he had to fight in a country where some years previously, 78 BC, the general Lucius Valerius Praeconinus had been defeated and killed, and the proconsul Lucius Manlius compelled to retreat with the loss of all his heavy equipment, he realized that he must proceed with extreme caution. Accordingly, he arranged for a supply of provisions, raised auxiliaries and cavalry, and called up individually many men of proved courage from Toulouse, Carcassonne, and Narbonne, towns in the province not far distant from Aquitania. He then marched into the territory of the Sutiates, who, on hearing of his approach, assembled a large force and sent on ahead their cavalry, in which they were very strong. They attacked our column on the march, first of all with the cavalry. When this was repulsed and pursued by ours, they suddenly unmasked their infantry, which was ambushed in a valley. The infantry renewed the action by falling upon our troops while they were in disorder. 21. A prolonged and fierce struggle ensued, for the Sutiates were emboldened by their past victories and thought that the fate of all Aquitania depended on their bravery, while our men wanted to show what they could do without their commander-in-chief and the other legions, and under a youthful leader. At length, exhausted by wounds, the enemy turned and fled. After killing a large number, Crassus advanced on their town and marched straight to the assault. As the garrison offered a stout resistance, he moved up mantlets and towers. Against these they first attempted a sortie, and then tunneled in the direction of the siege terrace and the mantlets. The Aquitani excel in this work, as there are copper mines and quarries in many parts of their country. But when they found that the vigilance of our troops prevented their effecting anything by this means, they sent envoys to Crassus asking him to accept their surrender. He consented, and at his command they handed over their arms. 22. While everyone's attention was occupied by these events, the king of the tribe, Adiatuanus, attempted a sortie from another part of the town with 600 followers who were bound to him by a vow of loyalty. The Sutiates call such persons solduri. The friend to whom they attach themselves undertakes to share with them all the good things of life, on the understanding that, if he meets with a violent end, they shall either share his fate or make away with themselves. And within the memory of man, none has yet been known to refuse to die when the friend to whom he had sworn allegiance was killed. Shouts arose from the nearest part of the fortifications, and the soldiers ran to arms. After a hard fight, Adiatuanus was driven back into the town, but in spite of what had happened, he prevailed on Crassus to let him surrender on the same terms as the rest. 23. After receiving the arms and hostages, Crassus started for the country of the Vocates and Tarosates. The natives were now thoroughly alarmed, hearing that the town, well protected both by its situation and by fortifications, had fallen within a few days of our army's arrival. They therefore sent envoys to their neighbours on every side, made promises of mutual loyalty, exchanged hostages, and mobilized their troops. They even sent to the nearest tribes of northern Spain and obtained from them reinforcements and generals whose arrival enabled them to take the field with large forces under commanders of great prestige. Men who had served throughout the Spanish War under Quintus Sertorius and were reputed military experts. Following Roman practice, they occupied carefully chosen positions, entrenched the camp, and took measures to intercept our convoys of supplies. Crassus's own forces were so small that they could not very well be divided, whereas the enemy could scour the countryside and block the roads, and at the same time leave an adequate guard in camp. Finding that this made it difficult to bring up grain and other supplies, and that the enemy's numbers were increasing daily, he thought he had better lose no time in bringing them to a decisive action. On referring the question to a council of war, he found that all the others were of the same opinion, and therefore determined to fight the next day. 24. At daybreak he brought out all his forces and deployed them in two lines, with the auxiliaries in the centre, and waited to see what plan of action the enemy would adopt. Although the Gauls, with their great numerical superiority and illustrious military record, had every confidence in the result of the engagement, they thought an even safer way would be to gain a bloodless victory by obstructing the roads and cutting off the army's supplies. And if a shortage of food compelled the Romans to retreat, their idea was to attack them on the march, when they would be hampered by the presence of the transport and dispirited by having to fight with their packs on their backs. Their leaders approved these plans, and when the Romans deployed their troops, the Gauls remained in camp. Crassus took note of this, and as the enemy's reluctance to fight gave the impression that they were afraid, and increased the fighting spirit of his own men, who were all heard saying that the camp should be attacked without delay, he delivered the customary address and complied with their unanimous desire by advancing to the assault. 25. Some filled up the trenches, others drove the defenders from the rampart and entrenchments with a rain of missiles, while the auxiliaries, in whose fighting quality Crassus had little confidence, supplied the rest with stones and weapons, and brought up sods for making a bank of earth, and so made a convincing show of fighting. The enemy too put up a determined and brave resistance, and the javelins that they hurled down from their elevated position did good execution. Meanwhile, some cavalrymen who had ridden round the camp reported to Crassus that the back of it was not so carefully fortified and offered easy access. 26. Crassus asked his cavalry officers to encourage their men by promises of liberal rewards to cooperate in a maneuver that he desired to execute. Under their guidance, the cohorts that had been left to guard the Roman camp, which was still fresh, were quickly led out and conducted by a long detour, so that they could not be seen from the enemy's camp, to the section of the defences referred to, while everyone's attention was concentrated on the fighting. Demolishing the fortifications, they gained a footing in the camp before the enemy could clearly see them or make out what was happening. On hearing the shouting at the back of the camp, our soldiers felt their strength renewed, as generally happens when men have hopes of winning, and redoubled their efforts. The enemy, finding themselves completely surrounded, were overwhelmed with despair, and had no other thought than to throw themselves over the rampart and flee for their lives. Our cavalry pursued them over perfectly flat plains, and of the 50,000 men known to have assembled from the Aquitani and the Cantabri, barely a quarter escaped. It was late at night when the cavalry returned to camp. 27. On receiving news of this battle, most of the Aquitanian tribes, including the Tabelli, Bigariones, Pitiani, Vocates, Tarosates, Elusates, Gates, Ausci, Garuni, Subuzates, and Cocosates surrendered to Crassus and sent hostages of their own accord. Only a few of the most distant tribes, relying on the approach of winter to save them, neglected to follow their example. Part 4. Indecisive campaign against the Morini, 56 BC. 28. About the same time, although the summer was nearly over, Caesar marched against the Morini and the Menapi. While peace was established throughout the rest of Gaul, they remained in arms and had never sent envoys to sue for peace, and he thought that a short campaign would suffice to conquer them. He found himself opposed by tactics quite different from those of the other Gauls. As they knew that the strongest tribes which had met Caesar in the field had been completely defeated, they took refuge with all their belongings in a region protected by a continuous belt of forests and marshes. On reaching the edge of the forest, Caesar began to construct a camp. No enemy had yet been seen, and the men were working in scattered groups, when suddenly the Gauls rushed out to the attack from all parts of the forest. Our men hastily seized their arms and chased them back into it, but after inflicting heavy losses upon them, pursued too far over rather difficult ground, and themselves suffered a few casualties. 29. Some days were then spent in felling trees in the forest. To prevent his soldiers being surprised by flank attacks while they were unarmed, Caesar placed all the felled timber parallel with the enemy's line of retreat, piling it so as to form a rampart on both sides. In an incredibly short time, a path was cleared for a considerable distance. But when the enemy's cattle and the tail end of their transport were already in our hands, while they were making for the denser part of the forest, such bad weather came on that the work had to be stopped, and as the rain continued, it became impossible to keep the soldiers on the canvas any longer. Accordingly, after ravaging all the countryside and burning the villages and farms, Caesar withdrew his troops and quartered them in the countries of the Olerci, the Lexovi, and the other tribes that had been recently in arms.